Janis is a really important part of that. So let me go on with her bio. She is also a Distinguished Toastmaster. She's made many speeches and is a former adult trainer. She's also a singer, songwriter, enthusiastic member of Don Heights Singers, a musician in various bands, and her favorite Unitarian principle is the inherent worth and dignity of every person. She will speak today on, well, here's the write-up on the topic. The United Nations called humanity reaching 8 billion people an opportunity. This is at the expense of other animals, diverse plants, the ocean, the forests. So what can be done about it? Why is growth a favorite word of politicians? Why is sustainability not the favorite word of politicians? So Janis is here to explore this concern and possible solutions. Janis.
Wow, that was quite a build-up all about me. But should we? Should each of us be concerned about the world population? In November of 2022, we passed 8 billion people. India is about to become the most populous country in the world, and China is now going to be relegated to second place. Well, did you know that the United Nations celebrates World Population Day, July 11th? This all began in 1987 when they did a special event called the Day of 5 Billion. They track the world population, and they have 9 standards to uphold human rights and family planning. I will get to that at the end of my speech, what those 9 standards are, so that you understand where we've been and where we're going to. Does overpopulation play into biodiversity loss and climate change? Or is it a way of keeping us focused on blaming the poor for the state of the world instead of looking at industrial pollution and environmental degradation? Well, you'll draw your own conclusions. We have a slide that's going to go up right now, slide number 1, and this is from the World Economic Forum, so that you can see what's happened. Population up to 1803, reached 8 billion. It took years. It took over 140 years to reach that point, from 1803 to the present. And as you look, you can see the numbers going down. So each time it's taking a little bit more time, or less time. So the next billion only took 124 years. We see 3 billion only took 33 years. 5 billion was 12 years, and it stayed pretty constant, 5 billion, 6 billion, 7 billion. We've reached 8 billion, and notice now the numbers are starting to go up. So what is driving that? The United Nations feels that human population is going to peak in 2100 at 10.9 billion. The Institute for Health and Metrics and Evaluation, however, thinks it will peak at 9.7 in 2064, but both predict that the human population will begin to fall. And we are actually seeing signs of that already. So in China, for example, you might have heard last week that their population is starting to decline. And it was the first decline they've experienced in 60 years. This is also happening in other countries around the world, especially countries that have a lot of baby boomers like Canada. Worldwide, birth rates are going down, but the difference is those that are getting older are living longer. Right now, we have a pyramid. The pyramid at the top is the older people, all the way at the bottom is younger people. What's happening is that we're having a reversal, and it's going to go this way where there's young people, a smaller number, supporting a lot of older people. This has a lot of ramifications for all of us. The three things that allowed the population to go up, however, were falling mortality rates, medicine, advances in medicine, and we did make progress in food production. Research and technology resulted in better crops year-round, resistant seeds, waste pesticides for insect infestations, and other methods. But what does all this growth mean? Well, we kind of already know we're exhausting natural resources, and that is uneven, unrestrained use of the resources. So what's happening is the natural resources are in deficit because we're consuming those resources at a faster rate than the planet is able to generate. We know that there is environmental degradation, unbridled use of natural resources, growth in the fossil fuel industry. You remember last week reading about what's happening in Germany. They wanted to open a coke plant and that there was a huge environmental protest there. Greta Thunberg was there, is one of them. Natural gas. And I should add even something as simple as this I read in Mother Jones. Stoves, gas stoves. It's now been pointed out that gas stoves emit a lot of pollution. And guess who's fighting back? The gas stove industry. Yes. We see with the issue of cost of living. What keeps cost of living? They're trying to keep the inflation down. So they've been raising all these interest rates. What does that do? It forces more people out of work. That might be great for the person who's trying to lower the inflation rate, but it's pretty bad for those workers. And everyone here, what have we experienced when we go to the grocery store? Sticker shock. Prices have been going up. I was absolutely shocked when my partner came home from the grocery store and he had bought apples, and a bag of apples had cost $12.99. So imagine what happens in underdeveloped countries with costs like that. On the positive side, though, we are experiencing technological advances, research and development, looking at solutions for the population's needs. And that is going to continue to happen. And hopefully, we will make some more strides along that way. But I want to talk about how this worry about population growth got started, where it is presently, and where it needs to go in the future. Population and the worry about overpopulation is not new. 1,700 years ago, a North African writer by the name of Tertullian thought the planet could not support so many people. And at that point, there was only approximately 190 million people on the planet. Plato wrote back in 400 BC that humans would benefit from, we'll use this word carefully, selective breeding. And we should also have a look at the doctrine of discovery. And rather than me tell you about it, I would like us to show a video by someone that many of you will recognize.
I think we always wondered why did they think it was right or just to do what they did was, to take our lands and to push us off our lands and try to eliminate us as a people. And then we discovered this doctrine of discovery, and it just kind of made things understandable as to where they got their direction from.
When Columbus landed, and he went back and he reported, and they said then, the leaders, and the Vatican was the most powerful voice in the world at that time. A papal bull, 1493, 1 year later. If there are no Christian nations in this new land you have discovered, I declare those lands to be empty. Terra nullius, very old Roman law that had been exercised in Africa, India, Europe. Further, if there are people there and they are not Christians, they do not have a right of title to land. They have only the right of occupancy. From our perspective, the same right as a rabbit running on the ground, or a turkey, or a deer, or a buffalo, or an Indian. They do not have a right of title to land. 1823, Supreme Court Justice John Marshall adjudicating the case, Johnson versus McIntosh. Two white men arguing over Ohio Indian land. He says, you boys have it all wrong. Don't you understand? This was settled long ago. They don't have a right of title to land. And he moved that principle into U.S. federal law, 1823. The doctrine of discovery became the doctrine of law today. Christian doctrine, specific. Wasn't Muslim doctrine, wasn't Jewish doctrine, Christian. And it prevails. It's here, it's a reality, but most people don't understand that, and most people don't know that. We didn't even understand that on 1991, when I first really said, wow, what's the doctrine of discovery? What is that? A young man by name was Steve Newcomb said, I got something, you guys gotta see it. Came out of Peru. Came out of people down there that were really digging. It was an unspoken conspiracy by states going on all those years. Shh, don't tell the Indians. We found out anyway, eventually, finally.
You can turn off the video now.
2007, Oneida versus.
That was a slight different from the one that I was going to show you, which was Buffy St. Marie that was explaining that. Don't know how I did that, but that's okay. That actually does explain it very well. Why does it matter that there was a doctrine of discovery? Because it sanctioned the brutal conquest and colonization of non-Christians who were deemed enemies of Christ. And this doctrine of discovery is still in place in many countries in the world, including the United States. Canada only renounced it in 2021 itself. So that's important. And that really goes to one of the principles of our Unitarian principles, the 8th principle. Individual and communal action that accountably dismantles racism and systemic barriers to include full inclusion. So you see, by law, back then, they already had stated that they could be racist. There was nothing to stop them. Theories of population growth curtailment really have their roots, however, in England in the late 1800s. If you've heard of the name Thomas Robert Malthus, has anyone heard that name, Thomas Robert Malthus? Aha. He was an 18th century polymath. I just discovered what a polymath is. It's a person who's well-versed in maybe 10 topics, like they're an expert. And he was a child prodigy. At the age of 2, he was reading. At the age of 5, he could read Greek and Latin. Okay? He was also a half-cousin of Charles Darwin. He was also a cleric, an economist, and a scholar. And he drew some interesting conclusions. In 1798, he wrote a book called an essay on the principle of population, where he decided rather pessimistically that if there were improvements in food production, this would lead to population growth and that you'd get a lot more undesirable poor people. In fact, I think my next slide might be a quote from him. You have an idea of what he thought. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. And sadly, this opinion was shared by a lot of people, including politicians. Theodore Roosevelt was quoted saying, Society has no business to permit degenerates to reproduce. In 1883, Francis Galton, another cousin of Charles Darwin, coined the term eugenics. He took it from the Greek word eugens, namely good in stock, basically saying that good breeding is people that have noble qualities. And it's pretty clear, if you had a chance to read him, he's against other races, the lower classes, women, and really believes in heredity superiority. This was the same England that used to proclaim, the sun will never set on the British Empire. But I see a problem there. Do you see it? Who gets to decide? For whom? Especially when you have theories that are based on maybe the leading thoughts of those days, but they don't have a serious basis in scientific facts. They're racist stereotypes. And what happened with eugenics is that it flourished. It spread. It spread in the late 19th century, and it spread to other countries, including the United States, Canada, Australia, Sweden, and many others. There were, in many countries, eugenic clubs that people belonged to. What was so frightening is that eugenicists labeled many people unfit. And what did that include? Ethnic and religious minorities, people of color, people with disabilities, urban poor, and LGBTQ individuals. We see, if we remember World War II, how this was embraced by Nazi Germany. It resulted in the murder and execution of 6 million Jews, Roma people, homosexuals, and others deemed unfit. The final solution of gas chambers. It's shocking, but it wasn't just in Nazi Germany. Writer Loretta Ross, in her Amicus article of 1994, wrote the following about what happened in the Americas. During the last century, women of color have been sterilized in astounding numbers, either directly or through unsafe birth control. Beginning in the 1870s, proponents of the Malthusian theories that were laid out and gave dire consequences for overbreeding among the poor and unfit joined with nativist Protestants to create a eugenics movement that lasted nearly 70 years. So between 1907 and 1945, when these laws were national and state policy, 45,000 Americans were sterilized. After Indiana, the state of India, enacted the first compulsory state sterilization law, which applied to the mentally deficient, those with certain types of mental illness, epileptics, sexual perverts, and criminals, 30 other states followed. At a time when much of white society considered African American and other people of color inferior, these vaguely worded statutes provided legal excuses for many forced operations. And can we really trust the Supreme Court? In 1927, they upheld the constitutionality of compulsory sterilization laws for the feeble-minded. Canada is no less blameless in this. In 2019, there was a press release from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and it indicated that this commission, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, expresses its deep concern over the claims of forced sterilizations against Indigenous women in Canada, they emphasized that non-consensual sterilizations cause pain and suffering to women affected and represent a form of gender-based violence and discrimination. As such, they urged Canada to guarantee effective access to justice for survivors and their families, and to conduct impartial and immediate investigations to hold those responsible and to take all the necessary measures to stop this practice of sterilizing women against their will. Now, 20 years ago, I met an Indigenous woman who had been sterilized against her will. And the scars that it left on her and the anger that she felt, it's probably beyond my comprehension. But it was real. The U.S. also had other things that it had done. In the early 70s, a federal district court in Alabama found that an indefinite number of poor women had been improperly coerced with threats of losing their welfare benefits, which caused them to have sterilization operations. And the federally funded Indian Health Services sterilized 3,000 Native Americans, women, during a 4-year period using unfair consent forms. So forms that people didn't really understand what they were signing, they weren't educated properly about it. Now I have a slide about the population bomb. This was a very popular book back in 1968. It was written by Paul Ehrlich, but he actually wrote it with his wife. However, the publisher didn't want two names to appear. They thought that wasn't very good for the book. He wrote, and I quote, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now." This was a very, very popular book. And it wasn't the only one that felt that way. And he made the rounds on the Carson show. But it scared people again. And so what we find when we read the Financial Post article from November 22nd is the following. Once again, a wave of population alarm was sweeping the world. The International Planned Parenthood Federation, the Population Council, the World Bank, the United Nations Population Fund, the Hugh Moore-backed Association for Voluntary Sterilization, and many other organizations promoted and funded programs to reduce fertility in poor places. But, and here's the big but, the results were horrific, according to Betsy Hartman, who is an author of Reproductive Rights and Wrongs. It was an expose of anti-population. Some population control programs pressured women into only using officially mandated contraceptives. In Egypt, Tunisia, Pakistan, South Korea, and Taiwan, health workers' salaries in a system that invites abuse were dictated by the number of IUDs they inserted into women. And I gotta say, some of those IUDs were not that great. And I can say that personally as having been a former IUD user, where it caused me a great deal of pain, caused a serious infection, and has since been taken off the market quite a long time ago. And in fact, a lot of these products that were taken off the market in North America were sent to the third world, which is really frightening. Imagine, in the Philippines, birth control pills were pitched out of helicopters over remote villages. Gee, that sounds like a really good policy. And millions of people were sterilized, often coercively, sometimes illegally, frequently in unsafe conditions in Mexico, Bolivia, Peru, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. In the 1970s and 80s, India, led by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and her son Sanjay, they embraced policies that many states required sterilization for men and women to obtain water, electricity, ration cards, medical care, or a pay raise. Teachers could expel a student from school if their parents weren't sterilized. More than 8 million men and women were sterilized in 1975 alone. And then we can look at China. China, when it adopted that one-child policy, this led to possibly, and we don't know because we can never get accurate numbers, but possibly 100 million sterilizations, coerced abortions, poor conditions, infection, sterility, death. And still we come up with the question, who has the right to dictate this? Who should or shouldn't have children? And how about the person whose bodies that they're dealing with, especially? But our concern is, can we meet the demand for human population growth? The answer probably could be yes. One of the big growing fields is agroecology. And agroecology is looking at more efficient ways of growing diverse types of vegetation. So we cannot just have monocrops. We have to go beyond that, especially crops that are suitable for the continents they're on. So crops such as wheat and corn may be suitable in North America, but they were not good for Africa, where millet and sorghum are much better choices. And the elements of this agroecology will include diversity in the food production, co-creating and sharing knowledge, and I was thinking of our group that we love to support, Seed Change, because diversity in seeds is very important. We know that we're going to have to do recycling. We have to have resilience. We have to have human and social values. We have to respect cultures and food traditions. We need responsible governance. Well, that's a tough one. And then we also need something that many people have talked about here. We need a just transition. In order to tackle the problems, environmental challenges like climate change, pollution, plummeting biodiversity, nations and businesses need to transition towards greener, resilient, and climate-neutral economies and societies. So what's standing in the way? Well, one of the things that's now slowing us down is that 214 million women in developing countries lack safe and effective family planning methods. And most of those women live in the 69 poorest countries on the planet. It's believed that if they could have had that planning, could have averted 67 million pregnancies and reduced by 1/3 the estimated 303,000 annual maternal deaths. So who is causing all this environmental degradation? Well, who is benefiting from polluting the earth? I guess we have to follow that trail that's called the money. Because 71% of all those global emissions are being created by 100 fossil fuel companies. Not sure that that's population growth didn't put that in place. Somebody's making a lot of money. A lot of these people are never seeing it. We know that the sea is being overfished. And who's doing that? The 10 most profitable companies that have these huge sea trawlers. 3 of them are from Japan, 1 from Thailand, 1 from Norway, 1 from South Korea, and 1 from the Netherlands. This isn't some poor fisherman who's just eking out some fish to feed his family and a few of his friends. And the unsustainable practices that they have, they're using nets that are catching a lot of mammals and other fish that aren't what they're trying to get, and without disregard. And they're dropping their nets, or when they break, they just leave them. Their nets are made of plastic. That's actually the biggest cause for Dead Sea zones, is plastic that's been wasted from these ships. And then we have to remember, even if you look at the solution of fish farming, well, there was a study done by Marcia Berenga, and she says that a 2-acre fish farm can produce as much waste as a town of 10,000 people. 10,000 people. And why? Because of overcrowding at the farm, feces, and antibiotics. And we have to keep in mind that we get 80% of our oxygen from the ocean. Do we have solutions, though? Yes, we do. With ingenuity, we can certainly feed people. We know that we can have urban farms. We know we can institute this agroecology. We can reduce food waste. Do you know that a third of the food that's grown on this planet right now is actually wasted? You might even have seen locally that the City of Toronto has been working very hard on encouraging less food waste. And that's one of the reasons why we have a little bio basket to throw out biological waste that can be recycled. Now, I told you at the beginning of this talk that there are 9 standards that must be met to protect the human rights of family planning, according to the Population Division. And here are those standards. Non-discrimination. Family planning information and services cannot be restricted on the basis of race, sex, language, religion, political affiliation, national origin, age, economic status, place of residence. You can read the rest. And it must be available. That's the huge problem, availability. It must be accessible. If people can't access it, it doesn't do them any good. We have to provide this information to people in an acceptable manner and respecting medical, but also cultures of those that are being accommodated. And we need good quality information going out there. People need to be empowered to make decisions. We need privacy, confidentiality. We need participation, not imposing from top down, but the participation of all. And we need accountability. We desperately need to empower women around the world. As Diana Cole notes in her book, Should We Control World Population? The Universal Declaration of Rights protects the integrity of all bodies, including sexual and reproductive functions. It prohibits violations in the flesh, such as rape, domestic violence, forced or underage marriage, and female genital mutilation. This logically includes the right not to have contraceptive devices inserted or fetuses removed without consent. Women need to have access to reproductive health. They need to have the right to choose the size of their family and also the choice of not having children. And on the other side of that, if people want not to have children, they sometimes find that they are denied sterilizations. So you're getting that side of it as well. When I talk about this doctrine of discovery, I don't know how many of you know that the Canadian Unitarian Council at its AGM in May will be talking about revoking this discovery. I'm pretty sure that they're going to vote to revoke it. They will be revoking the doctrine of discovery, they're going to update their bylaws, and they're going to look at reimagining goals and strategies and priorities for our national faith. But really, giving people a choice and a say in their own lives based on facts and not based on bias is a huge, huge issue. So do we have an overpopulation crisis? I like something that came around this week. Glenn sent out something, or a few people copied it. It was from Martin Luther King Jr., and it came up on January the 16th, which was his birthday. It really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one destiny affects all indirectly. May the blessings be.